Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining. I am Michelle Savage with XBRL US. We are a nonprofit data standards organization, and you're here for a webinar on government reporting and the FDTA, Florida, Michigan, Utah. We have with us today Victoria Lapenzina, who is financial administrator in the Florida Department of Financial Services, the Division of Accounting and Auditing, Bureau of Financial Reporting in the state of Florida. We have Stephanie Leiser, who's Fiscal Health Project Lead at the Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy. She's with the University of Michigan's Ford School of Public Policy. And finally, David Stringfellow, Deputy State Auditor, Chief Economist, and Data Scientist in the Office of the State Auditor in the state of Utah. I'm just going to cover a few logistical points before we go into the program itself. First, I want to mention that if you have any kind of audio or video problems as we go through the program, please email us at support@xbrl.us. And also, as we go through the program, if you have questions, please use the Q&A link that you see on the Zoom console and post your questions there. And we'll try to get to them as we go through the session. Last, we are offering CPE credit, so we'll be stopping at 2 points during the session to do our poll questions. So we're here today to talk about the state and local government reporting and the potential impact of the Financial Data Transparency Act on the FDT, or also called the FDTA. So the FDTA, which I think many of you are probably familiar with at this point, was signed into law on December 23rd, 2022. It calls for the use of data standards by certain FSOC agencies, which you see in the list here, including the U.S. Treasury and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Section 5823 in the FDTA calls for data standards to be required for municipal securities with implementation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. This slide shows the FDTA timeline, starting, of course, with the signing of the bill in 2022. This year, the SEC has already published their report to Congress on the value of data standardization. Going forward, we're going to see the rule published for public comment next year. That will address the data standards that are to be required. Then it will be up to each agency to write and publish for comment individual rules for various sets of reporting entities, including the municipal securities market. So we can expect 2027 to see final rules becoming effective. The legislation defines data standards that are to be adopted as including common identifiers, being open and non-proprietary, able to render data searchable and machine readable. They must use financial reporting requirements that are documented in machine readable taxonomies, incorporate standards developed and maintained by voluntary consensus standards bodies, and be consistent with applicable accounting and reporting principles. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to turn it over to Tori Lapenzina with the state of Florida, who's going to give us a demonstration of what's going on in Florida.
Hello, so sorry. Hi there, my name is Victoria Lapenzina. I'm with the Department of Financial Services with the state of Florida. I am here to talk to you today about the Logger X local government financial reporting and XBRL program that we've established here in Florida. In 2018, a statutory change occurred that stated that all local governments in Florida must report their annual financial reports to us in XBRL format. So for the past 5 years, we have been working to implement that with as little financial burden as possible towards the local government states here in Florida. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys, and I'm going to show you a little bit about how our system works and how that works for us. And as you can see here, this is our local government financial reporting system. Might look a little bit different for anybody here in the audience that uses a system to file their AFRs for the 2022 fiscal year. This is our admin view. One of the biggest things that we wanted to ensure when we created this was that we would have ownership of our taxonomy. And that we would be able to do edit that taxonomy as needs be for our local government, so that way you wouldn't have to wait for a response from any outside entity. It would just be solely on us. We did this by creating this account code management module, and it, as you can see here, is a tree module where this holds our whole taxonomy in place. By holding our taxonomy here, we'll be able to go in and make live edits or create future edits. So when I create the 2023 AFR, I'll have an editor here for 2023, and I'll be able to make any edits that we've decided that we'll be making for the 2023 reporting year. And these have just all of our different breakdowns for that. And by accomplishing this, we have a live action adjustment for our account codes that allows our local governments to file without procuring XBRL software, which was one of our biggest goals. As I stated, we have been working on this since 2018. So far, we just opened for the 2022 AFR reporting period. It's our first go round with AFR reports. It started in February and it just closed closed in June 30th. We currently have 21 out of 2,500 reported entities here in Florida, and all of them have reported in XBRL because the new system with an in-house taxonomy editor and taxonomy builder is able to tag that data for the entities live as they file. So even if they don't have taxonomy software of their own or XBRL software of their own, when they upload and file into the system, it does the automatic tagging for them, and therefore everybody is in compliant with statute. We've begun to use the data that's been generated over here in our reports. We have all of our external reports in XBRL format, both our canned reports, and I already have an AFR open for your viewing that shows what a XBRL statement looks like. I'm just kidding. An XBRL statement looks like for, we're going to go ahead and open a different one. Here's an XBRL statement. I'm so sorry about that. And what this looks like to an external user. If you click on a fact, it's data tagged. The local government did not have to do this. The system does it for them. When they upload, it is automatically converted and data tagged with that information that you saw that we have input into our account code management module. And that's how we did it here in Florida.
All right, thanks very much. Is there anything else that you wanted to present, or?
Nope, that was it for me, Michelle. I'm about to start coughing again. I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry. And we really appreciate that Tori has had a sinus infection in addition to being in a hurricane. So having her here is big plus. So we appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's totally okay. So I had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you before we move on, and we're actually going to take some CPE questions in a minute. But you had indicated that you guys prepared a software application so that government entities could report using this software application for free, correct? Right. But government entities could also use an application to, an outside commercial application to create a document as well. Is that right?
That's correct. The excuse me, the database that we have created allows for a variety of flexible reporting options for the local government, depending on what they want to report as. You can manually key your things, you can upload your document via an Excel template that we provide, or the entity can go out and purchase their own XBRL software and use those components to upload an XBRL statement directly into the system.
Okay, great. So there's lots of flexibility, and that's really the idea of standardization, is that the standard itself, the taxonomy that you developed, can be used in lots of different platforms. So
definitely correct.
Great. And can I ask, how costly was the program, and how long did it take to put it into place?
It took about 5 years overall, and we have probably hit definitely upwards of 6 figures, possibly $1 million I know that for our original contract, it was already 6 figures to get the original taxonomy created. And then since then, we have hired additional staff, and we have hired other contractors in order to help us make this mission possible to see our vision through to the end.
Great, thank you. And how many local units have filed so far?
Out of the 2,500 currently active local governments here in Florida, we've had about 2,100 that have filed so far their 2022 annual financial report. And we've had some people that have come and caught up with some of their older AFRs that are also available through the system. So we've had a lot of traffic on our new site.
That's great. That's great. So it's a lot of data in structured format. That's cool.
It really is.
All right. Well, thank you, Tori. I'm going to move on because I know we have a lot to cover today. So I am going to go to some poll questions, if I can find them here. For those of you getting CPE credit, you're going to want to take a look at your screen and see our first question here. Okay, so the question is, what is the expected implementation date for municipal markets data standards to be enacted per the FDTA legislation? Is it 2027, 2026, or 2025? So we'll just take a minute for this one. Okay, about another 15 seconds here. Okay, we're going to close down this poll, and the answer to that is probably 2027. Okay, we'll everything's not completely sure because the implementation is still ongoing, but that's the date that we're expecting. Okay, our second poll question is, which of the following agencies is responsible for carrying out the FDTA requirements for municipal bond issuers? Is it U.S. Treasury, or the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission, or the U.S. Federal Reserve Board? Okay, just about another 30 seconds here. Okay, another 10 seconds. All right, we're going to close that down. Thank you for answering. And the question was, the Securities Exchange Commission, the SEC, will be tasked with implementation here. So let's see. So now I'm going to bring up slides for our second speaker. Sorry, bear with me a second here. I have too many things going on my screen. All right, so Stephanie, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I am now sharing my screen. Great. So thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you everyone for having me here. I'm Stephanie Leiser. I am on the faculty of the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, and I'll share with you a little bit about what our process is like in Michigan with my particular perspective from the research community. So if you would like to go ahead and advance that slide. In Michigan, our State Department of Treasury is in charge of collecting all of this data from local governments. And so this is a graphic that I've borrowed from my colleagues of Treasury describing how that process looks. And it's basically two parallel processes. On the left-hand side, this is what's related to the audit. So all local governments are required to get an audit, most of them every year, and the smallest ones at least every other year. And then they upload that document in PDF format to Treasury's website, and then that's made available publicly, where people can go in and search and find the documents they're looking for and download them as PDFs. And then on the right-hand side, basically this is trying to collect a lot of the same data. We call this the F65 process. And local governments will log into a website, and they will hand enter all of their financial data. And this is mostly from the audited statements. So all of the numbers are supposed to match the audits. And they also collect some supplemental information related to local level income taxes and personnel and some additional information. So this document is uploaded, it is entered in the website, and so it is machine readable. And this F65 data is what is used, that you can download the data for research purposes. They do their internal analysis, and it also powers an externally facing dashboard, which I'll show you in a couple slides. And if you'd like to advance one more, there's one other reporting process that we've been focusing on. Go ahead, Michelle, on the next slide. This is also sort of going on in parallel with the creation of the ACFR. There's an additional reporting requirement related to the pension and OPEB plans that local governments have. And so this process requires them to fill out another form. It's called 5572, detailing information about their pension and OPEB plans, assets, liabilities, funded status, those sorts of things. And then that information is then collected and analyzed. And if you go ahead and advance one more, as I mentioned, the F65 data, which is the vast majority of the local government financial data, is collected, and then it feeds into this public-facing dashboard, the Michigan Community Financial Dashboard. And you can go on this website, and it gives you a picture of the whole state of Michigan. You can zoom in on whichever local government you want. You can choose cities, counties, townships, etc. by year, and then it gives you this breakdown of information. So this is for the city of Flint, and you can see on the right-hand side, the bar comes up to show the detail on on what's in that underlying F65 data. So you can click on additional breakdown for revenues and expenditures. And then, Michelle, if you go one more slide, you'll see if you just scroll down a little bit more, it gives you this data snapshot and analytics. And so these are some of the financial condition indicators that the Department of Treasury collects and tracks, just to sort of give an idea of how well governments are doing, and then the analytics places them in a percentile so we can compare them with each other on these various metrics. So these are very common type of financial condition metrics that you might see in an analysis of government fiscal health. So that's what the process of collecting the data looks like in Michigan, and this is sort of the public-facing dashboard. And you can go ahead to the next slide, Michelle. And you know, it's really great that we have all of this data collected in such detail, but it does present a few issues, especially from the research perspective, which again is where I'm coming from at the University of Michigan. So first point, the ACFRs, the audited financial statements, are really the gold standard for research, but they're only shared in PDF format. So if we want to download big data sets, we can use this F65 data, and in theory, it's supposed to match the ACFR data. But in practice, we've found a number of issues in using this data with errors in missing data. And in many cases, the F65 doesn't necessarily collect all of the same data points that you'll find in a comprehensive financial report. So it's, we make do with what we've, and it certainly serves a lot of purposes for analysis, but from a research perspective, it would really be much preferable to have that ACFR data in a shareable and structured format. So again, I think many researchers are using this data, not really realizing the limitations and not really understanding the differences between the ACFR data and what's reported in the F-65. And then, for those of us wanting to do these types of research, we end up having to hand collect a lot of ACFR data. And this is a frustration I share with many colleagues in research, is that we spend a lot of time just cutting and pasting from PDF documents. To the next slide. So that's sort of the problem from our research perspective, but this is also an issue for local governments themselves, in that it's essentially a duplicative process. So the local governments, they have to have their ACFRs, they spend the time and the money to have the ACFRs generated, but then that data doesn't really get used, and they have to then report into this F-65 process where they're supposed to be, kind of cutting and pasting from those PDF documents. And so that is time consuming, it's expensive, and ultimately is just duplicated from the local governments. And it also really limits the options they have to derive value and insights from the data that they do produce in the ACFRs, that gold standard of data. So, our impetus from being involved in this project from the very beginning has always been, how do we make that process more streamlined so that local governments can be easier and not have to do all that duplication, and then also to get more data, more value from that data on the back end. So go ahead. And so this is where our project comes in. We've been partnering with XBRL US. We created a taxonomy with them that's reflecting the ACFR, and at this point it's expanded beyond the ACFR as well. But really that was the starting point for it, to get that kind of gold standard of data for purposes of enhancing reliability and usability of the data for all stakeholders, streamlining reporting burdens for local governments, ultimately from a policy perspective to improve understanding of local fiscal health. So go ahead to the next slide, and I can show you we've done 3 pilots so far, and there are some others in the works. We've worked with the city of Flint, which I think most people will be at least somewhat familiar with, a medium-sized city in mid-Michigan. We've also worked with 2 smaller governments, Ogama County and Pine River Township, to test out this new taxonomy and look at what it actually looks like to implement it on the ground. And we've also been participating for the past year with the Michigan Department of Treasury, which has set up a working group to explore the feasibility of adopting an XBRL taxonomy to replace F-65 reporting in the state. So one more slide. This just kind of summarizes some of the lessons we've learned so far in working with the taxonomy and working with these pilots, is that we think standardizing and streamlining reporting will require leadership and ideally cooperation between states themselves. A lot of the first questions when we talk to local governments is, well, what is the state going to do and what do they want us to do? So we make sure we don't, waste our time doing things that are not going to comply with our state reporting requirements. We've also learned the task of adopting new technologies can be shared by states, local governments, and their auditors. We think auditors in particular are going to play a key role, because in many cases, they're already familiar with some of the technologies and organizational practices that need to be in place to adopt this kind of a standard. And then the last thing that I think we should all keep in mind as we move forward is local governments generally want to do this type of thing. They want to make use of their data, but they often simply lack the capacity in terms of time or skills to work through something like this. So local governments are working with a lot of constraints, and we want to be very sensitive to those constraints. So thank you very much.
Stephanie, thanks. Thanks very much for giving us that overview. I just have a couple questions for you before we move on to our next speaker. So, Stephanie, what were your initial expectations about implementing an XBRL program in Michigan? What was the impetus, and what were your real goals?
Yeah, like I said, our initial impetus, and we do work with local governments in our research center here at the University of Michigan. We would do something that would streamline the process for them and really kind of create efficiencies between that point of they're doing all the work to generate the data, and we want to use the data, but it goes through so many iterations and formats in between that it just was not making sense. So that's really our initial impetus. And then the bigger picture from our point of view is just that, that landscape of understanding what's going on with local government fiscal health, and really having the data to create those insights and to work with local governments so that they could derive the value from insights as well. So that's kind of our bigger picture view of this.
Okay, and I know that at the Center, for Local, State, and Urban Policy, you guys have a lot of contacts with local organizations, associations for counties and cities and special districts, and also with the accounting profession that serves those communities. What kind of reaction have you been getting from them? Because I know you've had a lot of conversations with them.
Yeah, absolutely. From the local governments themselves and the organizations that represent them, I think there's a lot of frustration in how the process works currently. They don't like that it's redundant. They don't like that there's all this duplication, and every different entity they need to report to requires it a little bit differently, whether it's the state or the federal government, or if they're getting grants, they're reporting a lot of the same data in many different formats, and that just takes time and energy that they don't have. So, that was sort of the initial reaction from governments is, okay, how are you going to make life easier today? So, but they do have the apprehension about, do I have to learn something new? Is this going to cost? And, is there a learning curve and all these types of things? From the accounting firms, I would say there's really been more of an acknowledgement of the bigger picture. They understand, because they have other clients, that things are moving more towards standardization and open data and things like that. So I think that was less of a barrier for them, but they have practical considerations about, okay, how do we fit this into our processes? How does this change our relationship with our clients, the local governments themselves? What sort of software do we need? What sort of training and skills do we need? So they have, I think, in general, more practical considerations and questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so stick around. We'll have more questions at the end. But I'm going to turn it over now, if I can get those slides up, to David Stringfellow. And sorry, David.
Thanks, Michelle. While you're transitioning, I'll just jump in. Happy to be here. Excited to see what some of the other states are doing. Utah has, we've been involved in trying to structure this data for quite a while. We pursued back in 2008 legislation that created a website called Transparent Utah, which was an effort to make this kind of financial data at the general ledger transaction level available to the public. So our state developed that, spent many millions developing that platform, and then our office upgraded that capability. The state auditor has been a clearinghouse for some of this financial information. We utilized this website clear back in 2009 to eliminate a lot of reporting requirements like Michigan has. We had forms, a lot of Excel files. I think you want to hit Control Home to go to the front, Michelle. And we eliminated those reporting requirements for the local governments. We have a quite extensive ability to grab data from local governments, our 1,500 governments at all levels, special districts, cities, counties, universities. If they don't comply with our reporting requirements, then they get their money turned off. They don't get to access their tax revenues or otherwise. So they're highly motivated to comply with our requirements. And we find those requirements to be very valuable because we want the public sector that has this massive share of the economy to be more efficient, more effective, and more governable, really, by their boards, their elected officials. And we view transparent insights into their financial records as a key component of that. So next slide, Michelle. If we look at how we did this, right, the gold standard, like Michigan said, are these audited financial statements, but often those statements and the expertise embedded in them get short shrift, right? They don't get used to maybe the extent that they should by the experts. So our effort was, okay, let's create an open public database that contains transaction level records. If you're going to structure it, just structure it and give people the actual data. And we did implement that. We phased it in for all of our governments, even these small little, cemetery districts where an 80-year-old's filling out a napkin to tell you their 5 transactions for the year. We have some portals like Florida had where they can go in and type in some of those transaction level details and they get compliant. We've definitely had data quality issues, right? People mess those transfers up or we notice and then they wipe and replace them. We have a Salesforce portal similar to Florida's where they can go in and then they map all that data into a uniform chart accounts so that we can kind of compare entities. But it's definitely a big investment for us to keep track of and clean that data. And then we also collect all those PDFs of the financial reports, their budgets, and a list of other reports that our legislature wants from these local governments on their capital spend and other kinds of ways they use resources. And then I view this exercise of structuring those PDFs as a way of bridging and unifying the micro data with these macro reports. And it lets people ask better questions of what's going on in the government. How do we keep track of them? Those spark lines in Michigan, right? If a government's kind of getting off track, and they do sometimes, right? Where maybe their governing entity doesn't realize if we put this big rec center in and we haven't really paid for it, we might not be able to pay our bills in a couple of years. And the elected officials eventually realize, oh, that was a problem. And then I think it also just enables better, it raises the cost of committing fraud, waste, or abuse when there's more insight into the data. Next slide. This is just an example from our website. You can go and we also give super user access to people, researchers, policy groups that care about the data. There are a lot of different associations where the entities themselves, the cities, the counties band together and want certain things. This data is uniform, it's accessible. People can get a super user account and get access to this 500 million record data set on GCP. But that inevitably leads to questions, right? When our legislative staff is using the data to say, exactly how much are we paying for water in the state of Utah across all these little governments? Because we're trying to save the Great Salt Lake right now. But we don't have the policy landscape sometimes, the data insight. We want to be data driven to make good policy, but sometimes that's really complicated and messy. How do we understand the differences in the structured data versus the unstructured but audited data? Which one's right? Is this due to some extra account or a valid or essential adjustment that the auditors made on the financial statement, but it's not reflected in the micro data? We've tried to unify those data sources so that people can use the data meaningfully for policy discussions and model building. How do we do better? Next slide. This is an example of, we've worked on this a couple of years and have talked with XBRL over the last 5-8 years while we've implemented some of this. How do we unite this data? This is an example from a company that we worked with and have, we're trying to do a project where they've taken machine learning, artificial intelligence, if you think that's an overhyped word, we'll reference large language models that get into the technicalities of it, right? Guess what? Computers are going to read your data, even if you don't structure them. Large language models are going to structure this data in the financial PDFs and scan all of those, vectorize them, and ask them questions. And that's what we did here. This is a text box where we loaded a sample of, a couple thousand of these PDFs, and they built a large language model to investigate them. And we just had the user type in, extract this financial information with XBRL and output it in XML format. Next slide. This was the data that came up in about 3 seconds. Left-hand version, XML file, tried to tag with the XBRL, taxonomy that we grabbed from the website. And then the financial statement over on the right, you can see it was smart enough to grab that cash and cash equivalents label and tag it with the sum of those two elements, right? So now we have maybe this basis of, instead of my analyst going in like Michigan was saying and typing in a few numbers from the financial statement to say, hey, wait, the micro data is not adding up. We're trying to check it against the global data, and we want to know which one's right or how to reconcile them. And is the data, telling us a certain story? And does having two sources of the data change that story? XBRL can go in and kind of pre-read that, and then that gives our analysts a more ability to go in and say, hey, we don't have to type in a bunch of numbers. We can just start evaluating it. Now, even if it's not perfect at reading the PDF and tagging it, it gets you some of the way there so that other people can maybe go in and either re-tag or fix the data issues if it's not accurate. But it eliminates a whole host of problems when you say, to generate the XBRL document, you got to change your whole financial system. You got to invest a bunch of money, time, effort that, guess what, maybe it's not funded, right? So that's how local governments sometimes are like, whoa, we are asked to do a big job and it takes a lot of time and effort and money. And how do we get there? So we're viewing this as that same kind of exercise in Florida and Michigan. How do you get better data, better information in the most efficient, effective way possible? Next slide. And this was just the proof of concept, right? Can this AI tool read the data, give us something meaningful as the output? We gave them those PDFs, it processed the documents. Users could type queries about what that means. It does all this semantic matching, and the large language model correlates, cash equivalents with, hey, XBRL has something called cash equivalents. Let's match those up. It outputs the XML or any other format that you could care about. And then the humans can actually do the analyzing, the testing, the interpreting of the data, and leave the busy work of typing in numbers to the computers that are really good at that part of it. Next slide. So our structured data and our report review, we go in and make the same kinds of things that Michigan was doing, right? Fiscal distress dashboards. How can we be more proactive in getting ahead of our governments getting themselves in trouble, where if we intervened a little bit earlier, we could avoid a lot of pain to citizens, the elected officials, their governments. Next slide. Big picture though, we just really care about getting the public into this analytics space a little bit more. Government, we were, I would argue, the first purveyors of big data, right? You could go back a couple thousand years to libraries, or one of my former bosses at the Census Bureau, his job was to take a big ruler across all these desks in an old World War II hospital and hammer on the desks, getting the analysts to turn in their papers so we could assemble all these financial statistics, right? About the economy or governments specifically. That was a big exercise, warehouses of paper, moving around, changing numbers. Now we can do it all in virtual space. The costs are so much lower than they were 100 years ago, right? To generate good data. We want to give those insights to the policymakers so that they can be more data-driven. People want to be data-driven. They want to claim that they're data-driven, but it takes a lot of work to get there, to unify that ecosystem, to give meaningful reports to people where the experts and the common user who hops on a website to search the college football coach's salary, now he's like, wait a second, what else can I learn about? I was really mad about my city's pothole situation. What are we doing there? Are we spending the right amount of money on that? How do we compare to other cities? Wait, who's the contractor that's doing that? Why are we paying them what we're paying them? It leads to a lot of new questions that you typically couldn't answer because people just said it was impossible. Well, we don't know. Give us 3 months and we'll analyze it and tell you or write a report about it. Where if you give them access to the microdata, now you can have a lot of citizens or others looking into that data and answering questions for themselves based on what they're seeing. That still leaves space for the experts to come in and have a better conversation about it, but it's democratizing that process. These are just a few examples of things we've done with this data, and pairing it up with operational data that the government has, and then presenting that to the public in a way that they can consume and have more of a voice or insight into this policy process. So next slide. I think that's it for me. Happy to answer any questions, Michelle.
David, thanks very much. I just have a couple questions for you, and then I'm going to open up to the rest of the panelists to come back on. You talked about creating this data in structured formats using an XBRL taxonomy. Why do you feel it's important to use an XBRL taxonomy that's kind of agreed upon and structured in a certain way?
Well, if I think the auditors, the experts, they want their insights included in the conversation, right? That needs to be in the mix. And if you don't have this tagging strategy where you can meaningfully communicate stuff that's been archived in PDFs and maybe read by a couple other experts, right? Not that many people read the ACFRs cover to cover. Usually it's the 4 or 5 people finally finishing the production process that read them. If you want those insights in the discussion in public policy, you need to tag that stuff and get it involved. If the machines can't read it, it doesn't exist. Like auditors are big fans of saying if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. If it's not machine readable, it's going to get missed. And that's going to cause problems for who's misinterpreting the data, right? If you want your insights involved, it needs to be tagged or you're going to miss the boat. So take that as an opportunity. And I'd say this is one thing governments maybe are a little bit behind the curve of data science, right? How do we take that and make that part of the conversation and increase the quality, effectiveness of our public policy, delivering goods and services to the public? That's one method in which we can leverage that data so that it's not just an exercise in, prompting you to watch the next special on your favorite streaming platform. It's actually making a real world impact in your kid's classroom, or how we build a road, or what we're doing in our prison system or in our healthcare system, right? That there's a lot of low hanging fruit where this data could make a difference in prompting policymakers to make better choices where right now they're not obvious.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to open it up to Tori and Stephanie, if you want to come back on your cameras again and off mute. And I also want to remind people that we do have, you can post questions. We do have time for questions, and I've got a few of my own, but then we've already gotten a few questions in. So one question I have for all of you, because you've got experience in doing this, is concern that I've heard, that I think we've all heard from a lot of governments, is that there are so many different kinds of governments. There's special district, general purpose governments, and one taxonomy or one set of standards cannot possibly handle all of that. How do you feel this could be handled?
I can tackle that really fast. I would just say that's absurd. We can mark up the genetic diversity of a biome, right? That's way more complex than simple governments. Like on the order of complexity, that's nothing. Like we are able to do this job and keep track of things that are even really complicated in a way that you're not unique. Like a city is not unique. A special district is not unique. There's thousands of them in the country. And it's just figuring out the right layer at which we represent them and then doing that consistently and effectively.
I would add to, I'm sorry, Tori, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Florida tackled the differences between the local governments by just creating a tree style taxonomy. It keeps it simple. So that way you have, your whole taxonomy and you've got your different branches for your different local governments. And that's how we tackled it, at least in Florida. Just keep it simple, and that allows for us to flexible and scalable taxonomy that allows us to grow and edit it.
I would just add too, I think the important thing to remember about the taxonomies is they're really just digital representations of the accounting standards that already exist. So we already know how to follow GAAP and implement GAAP and, with GASB guidance and all those types of things. So I think, you know, a taxonomy is nothing more or less than the accounting standards we already follow, is just digitizing them. And so we're not implementing any new restrictions or anything when you implement an open data standard or a taxonomy like this. So, you know, it might be that there's a lot of heterogeneity among local governments, but, you know, when it comes to it, they all have assets. And so we know that that category of assets is going to exist for everyone. And then the type of assets, there might be some variation in that. But we already have those definitions. We already have the accounting standards that we use in order to do accounting to begin with. So this is really a digitization of that.
I think one of those concerns validly, Michelle, is how to implement it when they think it needs to be their operational chart of accounts, right? Where it's like, oh, this is a big, crazy change in our accounting system. And it usually isn't. You don't have to do it that way. You can implement it where taxonomies can capture other, right? Typically, researchers don't like the other category because it's like anything that didn't fit in box A through F17, right? It can go in some other box and then integrate with, well, how do you treat things that are, you know, they're like an apple, but they're so unique? Well, we just cared it was an apple. You didn't need to fully represent it in the taxonomy.
Right. And one of the things that just on the corporate side with taxonomies continually change because accounting standards change. So we have to be able to resolve them over time. And if additional elements are needed, then the managers of the taxonomy, be it the SEC or GASB or whoever it may be, just review those add-ons and say, okay, these look like they should be going to the base taxonomy now. So things can always change over time and get better and better, frankly. So one other question that came in that actually builds on the taxonomy is, and this is for Tori, is who developed Florida taxonomies? You don't have to name names or companies if you don't want to, but just like, how did that whole process happen for you?
We issued an RFP and we ended up going with Dinocrates and Visma, and that's it's public record who assisted and created our original taxonomies. We originally contracted with Dinocrates, who outsourced to Visma in the Netherlands, and we contracted with them for about a year to create our original annual financial report taxonomy. And then since then, we have started creating addendums to their taxonomy once they handed it over to us in our contract. And it's that way we could fully integrate an entire AFR into an XBRL taxonomy. Because our base taxonomy that we received from Visma only included the balance sheet items, revenues, and expenditures.
Okay. Okay. Another question I have is, this kind of builds on the issue with, kind of standardizing across the board. Is what do you think is the biggest challenge facing implementation of data standardization? Is it, if it's not standardization, and kind of making everybody the same, what are the biggest problems that you think will be encountered if the FDTA goes forward as expected and there is an implementation required? It's for anybody.
Yeah, I can take a first stab at this. I mean, I think the big question is always, and the first question is always, what's the cost and what's the learning curve of figuring out how to do this? And, I know one of the big objections to the FDTA is that it is an unfunded mandate. And it requires, local governments and municipal issuers to do a lot of work to, to get new software or figure out how to do different things. And, I that's certainly valid. I think, given that that's the reality, one of the important things that we're trying to advocate for, and this is, again, why we want to advocate for open standards, is that, whatever the solution is, it needs to be open source and it needs to be, accessible. And so, like you tried to do in Florida, there doesn't need to be one software everybody's locked into. There's a standard and anyone can build off of it, and you can work to build this robust marketplace of solutions, and that can bring that price point down as much as possible for everyone. And, so you have everything from free Excel-based applications for the very smallest issuers, or they can go in and log on a web portal. And then for more sophisticated municipalities and states who want to have, data or software with more bells and whistles, they can do that too. But it's really the openness of the standard that's going to create those opportunities for efficiencies and economies of scale to try to drive that cost down as much as possible.
Great. David, Tori, do you have any other thoughts on that, or?
I just tag on to this in noticing a question in there about biggest impediments to implementing data strategies like this, the money, or is it the democratization of the data that leads to confusion, or better, like results, understanding the results? I think experts are a little too protective of their answers, where they think by making this data more available to people, it's going to confuse the issue more than it's going to help. And I'd say that is a possibility, right? Like the extra data does create this opportunity for misunderstandings, but I think it's too narrow of a focus that we implemented these standards of making this data better, collecting it, like distributing it to the public. It's led to a lot of, I would say, improvements, even within the messiness of the data, because the public, I don't know if people have looked at the statistics for trusting government lately, but it's not great. So you got to be able to not just tell your story. You got to show and tell your story, or you're not going to bring people along. Bringing people along and showing them from end to end how they could do this work themselves, or at some level, at least gain insight. Auditing and that kind of level of investigation still has a lot of public trust. We want to rebuild public trust in our institutions, start with the things they trust and expand from there. And this is one opportunity, I think, where it's worth the public investment. It's a really small slice of money relative to our hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars we're spending in the public sphere. The people that can take that as a policy kind of big picture view and use that, I think it's something that you're going to win at almost every time if we do it right. And that's why government really should grab a lot more of this and put it into the human capital of how we produce public goods and services, because we're too light on data science, analytics, computing, and then cleaning up our data in a way and making it presentable to the public.
Thank you, David. One question, a question that came in for Tori. I realize that the AFR covers fund financial statements. Is there any plan at the division to extend coverage to GASB 34 government-wide statements, or would that require new legislation?
No, Mark, it won't require new legislation. We do plan on implementing and doing some changes here in the future. It just takes us a little while to implement all those changes, but you will be hearing about those changes moving forward, so that way we're compliant with GASB 34 governmental statements.
Yeah, some of the members of the XBRL community are very eager for more data from you, Tori. So,
well, by February you'll have everything in a taxonomy XBRL statement from 2011 to 2022. So be ready for that data conversion.
that's very exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Another question, is there a reference link between the XBRL tags and the GASB standards to ensure quality control of the financial assertions? And I think this is a question, maybe Stephanie, you could take this, just in terms of how the Act for taxonomy is structured. And then Tori, I don't know if you guys have done that as well in the AFR taxonomy. It'd be interesting to hear that.
Yeah, if I'm understanding the question correctly, in the taxonomy, the Act for taxonomy that we worked on with XBRL US, in the documentation of that taxonomy, in terms of definitions and references, it's all linked to the underlying GASB citations or GAP citations, depending on which element you're talking about. So that's all documented in the taxonomy itself. Michelle, I don't know if, is there something you might add to that?
No, that kind of says it all. Yeah, the GASB references are in the taxonomy, so it's all kind of tied together by element. And Tori, is it that way in the Florida taxonomy as well?
It is. We have references for our chart of accounts, and for every chart of accounts that does have a GASB authority behind it, it is referenced in that reference link.
Okay, great. Okay, and then I have, let's see if there's any other questions coming in. I think we've got to all of them. I just have one more question for everybody, and then I'm going to go to poll questions because we need to get those done, unless we have more questions coming in. But what would you recommend? Now we're sort of at the precipice of throwing ourselves into FDTA, and there's still a lot of unknowns about what standard will be chosen, what will be required to be reported in standardized format. What would your recommendations be to states and then to individual governments within those states for right now? Question for the whole panel.
Yeah, I can start. So on the state question in particular is, I mentioned this a few minutes ago. I think state leadership is going to be really important in this process, and to the extent that states can kind of take on those leadership positions of working together and trying to get on the same page of what they're doing, that's going to make it that much easier for local governments instead of every state sort of moving in a different direction. And then I think that will just cause confusion. From the point of view of local governments, a couple of recommendations I would make right now is, number one, to think about your data that you generate and what you might want from it that you don't currently get. In demonstrating this to a lot of local governments, one of the things they thought was really cool is like, okay, I'm going to pull up my ACFR, and it's like this crypto note version of it. Now I can click on a number and understand what that number means because this pops up in a little pop-up next to it. And so, they said like, oh, we can present this to our board. This is great. Or if we have our neighbor do this, then we can benchmark. And so I think local governments can start thinking about, new ways that they can be using their data and what insights do they actually want to glean from their data. And so that will help point us in the direction of, okay, how do we make sure the standards serve that purpose? How do we make sure that the data are going to be able to be used for that purpose, rather than sort of reacting to what others tell us we should be reporting and what others tell us that we need to do. So that was my first recommendation for local governments. Then my second recommendation would be to start working with your auditors and those you work with in auditing and preparing that the ACFRs and your financial information. And to the extent that you can build into your planning with your auditors and sort of pave the road for that process and get it on everybody's radar, I think it'll make it easier than, again, sort of reacting down the line once the standards are actually in place. So.
And just echoing Stephanie a little bit, like have a plan for quality control after you generate your data, because people will generate and be compliant, but it might not be fully representative of what they want it to be. So I just say have a plan in place for kind of benchmarking the quality, and then implement that earlier rather than later. So trust doesn't get undermined between multiple sources of why does this say something different than this, when it's just a technical problem of delivering the same data. That happens in every implementation. It'll be a little messy, but just have a plan in place for analyzing your own data generating mechanism and seeing if they're matching up the way you expect.
That's a great point. Tori?
Great point. I will reiterate what Stephanie said, in that if you're a state government, it's always imperative when you're moving forward with these projects to have buy-in from your leadership. Their support is so integral when you're moving forward with these kinds of projects and making sure that your data quality and your XBRL taxonomies are a standard. And then for local governments, all I could say is if you don't follow the state government chart of accounts, please always make sure you have a crosswalk. It makes it so much easier when you're reporting.
Great, thank you. I want to thank everybody. Please stay on because we do have some poll questions that I've got to run through quickly. But I want to thank all of our speakers. You guys were fabulous, and this was really, really helpful and interesting. And we'd like to have you back another time when things will be continually changing. So thanks again. With that, I'm going to jump to poll questions, and if everybody can just stick around, we've got 2 more poll questions we've got to do here. Okay. So the first poll question you see here is, when did the state of Florida mandate the use of structured standardized data? Was it 2020, 2019, or 2018? Okay, we'll take about another 30 seconds for this. Okay, we're gonna end this poll in a minute here and go to our final question. Okay, where is Form F-65 required to be reported by local governments to state treasury? Is it in the state of Florida, state of Utah, or the state of Michigan? Right, about another 30 seconds here. Okay, and I think I'm gonna close down this poll question. And the answer here is in the state of Michigan, the F-65 is the additional document that needs to be filled out. Okay, and then I want to share my screen just for a minute here and talk to you about another event coming up that may be of interest. We are holding an annual conference on November 9th. And this event is focusing on the FDTA and government reporting. It's called GovFin 2023, Empowering Governments, Modernizing Reporting. And we do have, it's going to be held at 1801 K Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. And we have a lot of great speakers lined up. We have the Securities and Exchange Commission, Office of Municipal Securities, the Government Accounting Standards Board, the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, a number of people from the state of Ohio, from Michigan. We have the Global LEI Foundation. We also have QSIP and Bloomberg, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Department of Education, and the Data Foundation. This is the URL that you can go to learn more about the sessions and register. And we also have, I believe, that today is the last day for our reduced pricing. So please jump on it now. And we have early bird pricing going on today, and it's gonna increase a little bit starting in the next few days. So hope to see you all there, and we will have other webinars as well. And appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.